Welcome to Let's Talk Special Economic Zones, raising awareness of the impact of SEZs on people, planet, profits, and governance with Ainsley Brown.
Hi, welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk Special Economic Zones. I'm your host, Ainsley Brown, and in today's episode, we're going to touch on the sovereign debt crisis and special economic zone development. I did a piece, an opinion piece for uh, FDI Intelligence, which recently came out, their latest issue entitled The Elephant in the Room Secretly Shaping Zone Development. And that's the debt crisis. The world is literally drowning in debt. Sovereign debt, and that excludes personal debt and so forth. We're talking about debt owed by governments, whether national governments or sub-governments, city or provincial or statewide. Um, Governments that in 2022, according to a UNCTAD report, topped 92 trillion US dollars. Yes, 92 trillion dollars. That's the highest it's ever been. It skyrocketed after COVID or during COVID, I suppose, but because of debts borrowing that happened in order to meet the humanitarian crisis. But it is something that is being discussed, and it's, right around the world. There is some um, mechanisms being put in place or attempting to be put in place to address it. It's hasn't worked fully, but or worked for in some instances, but not in all instances. But it is a major issue for the global economy, not just special economic zones. But I wanted to make that link to special economic zones because it's definitely having an impact. And the reason why it would have an impact is given the nature of what zones are, or the functions of zones in terms of being uh, a mechanism or a method to stimulate growth within economies, growing exports, growing jobs, growing development, etc. for countries, whether that's developing countries or developed countries. So this high level of debt would impact that development or that tool, the specific tool, special economic zone. So whether you want to call them special economic zones, free zones, free trade zones, foreign trade zones, enterprise areas, it's the same thing. It's a geographic space designated by a government that gives special incentives to operate in there. And there are certain rules that are different from the rest of the economy and things like that. Now, when it comes to debt, that 92 trillion, funnily enough, is owed mostly by the developed world. Only 30% is owed by the developing countries. And of that, 70% of it is owed by, I think, India, China, Brazil. Um, they owe 70% of that. So most of that debt is actually owed by the richer countries. The difference, though, between the richer countries and the poorer countries is the terms, not the size of the debt, but the terms of which they borrowed the money. The poorer countries had higher interest rates and more severe um I guess payback mechanisms that they needed to do, which is then impacting their development. And it's one of those things where you don't want to see people go into default because sovereign defaults, personal bankruptcy is devastating. But imagine a bankruptcy of a country, right? If somebody goes into default and it then spirals down in terms of development and cutting of spending in order to pay off debts and so forth. Um, right now, in fact, the situation is so bad that over 3.3 billion people globally spend more money, or in countries spend more money than on debt repayment than on health and education. That's not good. Imagine that, health and education should be two prime spenders of any government, no matter whether it's a developed country or developing country. Um, but in terms of how it directly would impact special economic zones are associated with fiscal incentives, or incentives, I should say. I shouldn't just say fiscal, because there's different types. There's non-fiscal, and there's also financial. Financial mean literally money that is given out, but fiscal means it's some sort of tax break. Those cost money, even though they're generally based on revenue foregone that is not collected. Governments choose not to collect it. So say your income tax is at 20%, but in your zone it's 10%, right? So you reduced it for people operating, or companies operating within the zone. So you're foregone collecting those taxes. It still costs the government money, right? Because revenue foregone is in many ways revenue lost, right? But you're doing it for a purpose, to stimulate, one, attracting that investment for them to come in and build out and, employ more people and export and all of those good things, right? So it if you're paying more on debt repayment than you're paying on health and education, chances are you probably will not, if you have a zone program, you probably won't adjust it to, say, sweeten the pot, or even adjust it in certain ways where, it might be less attractive, right? You and there are other factors at play too, because there's the whole, pillar two from the OECD and how that works with corporate income tax, right? Making the space for the space for, competition based on, incentives even narrower, right? So countries have to get more creative, but then even that creativity costs money. So, and when you have a zone program, you're gonna have different services, aftercare services, investment attraction services. All of those cost money. So when you're looking to cut, that might be an area that you cut. But then it creates somewhat of a paradox, because the very thing that you need, which is development and growth to get you out of debt, right? You can't borrow your way out of it. You can borrow, maybe at more favorable terms, and there's temporary relief and give you a certain level of macroeconomic stability, which is all great, and in many ways a precondition to growth and to get you out, but it's not sufficient. Growth is what it will take to get you out, and special economic zones are a growth inducement tool. So if you then are cutting those, or cutting the attractiveness, you're then further spiraling. So, as I said in the piece, they're impaled on, the horns of a dilemma, in terms of not being able to borrow, not being able to, sweeten the incentive. So what do you do? You literally have to bite the bullet. Typically, you then go to, or countries will go to what they call the lender of last resort, the IMF, International Monetary Fund. And of late, how they've structured their deals, they've started to add some growth elements in their deals and so forth. So it's when you're negotiating with them, you have to, um, go in and say, yes, we recognize that we need macroeconomic stability. That's the first order of things. But growth, is how we're going to really get ourselves out of this challenge and pay you back as a lender, and pay the other lenders back. So we need to put forward a reasonable, rational, program, um, not just special economic zones, but special economic zones will be part of it, to get us out of that predicament that we're in. So if you like this episode, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to see me do a particular topic, or if you want to comment, just leave me a comment down below and I'll get right back to you. Bye for now.